Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Theresa May is about to welcome the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, to Downing Street. The first time the pair have met since the Prime Minister's speech in Florence. The meeting is being held in parallel with the fourth round of Brexit talks, which got underway in Brussels yesterday. So let's cross now to Downing Street and our correspondent, Leila Nathu. Hello, Leila, in Downing Street. Is this meeting with Donald Tusk about putting pressure on him to change what they see as the rigid formula for the Brexit negotiations?
Well, I think, Joe, it's Michel Barnier who is doing the negotiating on behalf of the EU, but it's the EU Council that is responsible for the guidelines, and it will be the 27 EU heads of state who decide whether enough progress has been made on settling all the divorce matters before talks can turn to trade. Now, Theresa May, I think, is keen to try and capitalise on some of the goodwill she thinks she's generated by her Florence speech, offering to honour the UK's obligations to the current EU budget, trying to make an offer to EU citizens, and talking about, for the first time explicitly, the idea of this transition period. We've heard from Michel Barnier already yesterday as the latest round of Brexit talks is already underway in Brussels. He's saying, yes, I welcome the speech, but it has to be translated into concrete negotiating positions. So I don't think Donald Tusk is going to deviate much from Michel Barnier's position. I don't think there's any sense he's setting out to try and undermine that or try and skirt around the line from the official EU negotiator. But certainly I think Theresa May, it's important for her to have new channels open, different channels open, so she can keep the communication going to try to sort of inch towards persuading them that she's serious enough and that the offer is enough to get those talks onto trade.
So do you think there is going to be, either in the talks going on in Brussels or between Donald Tusk and Theresa May in Downing Street, any moment of clarity that Michel Barnier has been calling for?
Well, I think the real action will be in Brussels, and I think this will be a crucial week for those talks because it is the first round of talks since that major intervention by Theresa May in Florence, certainly something that she hoped would kickstart the process. But I think this is a bit of more of a charm offensive, really. It's another diplomatic manoeuvre. We've got Boris Johnson out in Romania, the Czech Republic, Slovakia also talking Brexit there, as well as Liam Fox also being in Brussels. So I think there are various lines open, but I think the real test will come at the end of this week of negotiations in Brussels to see how far along Theresa May has managed to shift things with that speech in Florence.
Nathu in Downing Street, thank you. Now, as I say, the Brexit talks are continuing in Brussels this week, and it's the first chance for the EU negotiating team to respond formally to the Prime Minister's Florence speech. To assess how the speech is being received in Brussels, we can talk now to the Belgian MEP, Philippe Lambert, who is on the European Parliament Brexit Steering Group. Welcome to the Daily Politics. How did you receive the speech by Theresa May in Florence?
Well, my reaction was better late than never. She could have made these openings at Lancaster House last year. She could have made them when she triggered Article 50, and it took her until September this year to do it. So what a waste of time. Well, if the UK is serious about opening talks on the future relationship, then time is of the essence, and we are still dithering. We have been waiting for a long time to see these openings. Now they have to be translated into real negotiation proposals in the talks that are taking place in Brussels as we speak. We'll see whether that is the case, but even if it were the case, I wonder whether it is still possible to declare that sufficient progress has been achieved to open the second phase of negotiations as of October. I have my doubts about that because, well, for instance, if you look at Ireland, declaring that there will be no physical border is a nice thing, but actually the only way to get there would, for instance, to have the whole island of Ireland part of the single market, and we know that this is not in the cards. So what I believe is that there are some internal contradictions in the UK position that will make it very difficult for the British government to substantify the principles that Theresa May has announced last week in Florence.
Right, but she has moved. Theresa May did make an offer financially, without a specific figure on it, but saying that she wouldn't, want to leave EU members out of pocket. She also talked about the transition period, where things would stay pretty much the same. So if she's moved and you accept that, why doesn't that now unlock the negotiations to start talking more broadly about a free trade deal, which would actually solve the issue of talking about the border in Ireland?
I hope that you will appreciate that one thing is to make speeches, another thing is to agree on things on paper, and that is precisely what is being done this week in Brussels. So if, for instance, on the financial settlement, if her promises are translated into firm offers and a specific response of the UK government to the very detailed document that the European Commission has put on the table already a number of weeks ago, then indeed progress will be made on this issue, and indeed we might get closer to sufficient progress on that front. Ireland, I told you how difficult it would be, because basically sufficient progress would mean that we have the outline of the solution. And right now we have principles, but we do not have a solution that fit those principles. And the point I was making is that actually the various principles that have been announced are irreconcilable with one another. So I have yet to see the contours of a solution. On citizens' rights, I think this is the area where the most progress has been booked so far. I think that we need to make clear what the jurisdiction of the ECJ will be, and what the rights of the people who currently reside in the UK will be. Probably there too there's still a chance to meet the target. But again, on Ireland, I really fail to see how we can reconcile those differences. And to be honest, sometimes I think that this might be the factor that will derail the Brexit negotiation even more than money, because the principles that the UK government has put on paper, so a border, because, well, UK out of the single market, UK out of the customs union means a border, and at the same time no border. I mean, well, you can't have it both ways, and this I don't know how we reconcile.
Okay, so you actually think, Philippe Lambert, that Ireland, the issue of that border, could be the issue that derails these Brexit negotiations above all other, despite the fact that both sides seem to be genuinely committed to finding a workable solution?
Yeah, no, I agree with the commitment. I have no doubt that there is commitment, but one thing is to have a commitment. The other thing is whether this is practically possible. You know, there's only so much that you can deviate from reality, and if the reality is that some want a border while saying that they want no border, I mean, I don't know how you reconcile that. And so, for all the goodwill that you may see around the table, you can't. It's not just a question of having your cake and eating it. It's having countries, black and white. It's very hard to have it at the same time.
Philippe Lambert, thank you very much for joining us. And joining me here in Brighton is the Labour MP John Mann, who supported Leave in the EU referendum. Welcome to the Daily Politics. And still does. You haven't changed your mind.
Not at all.
Do you think people in Labour have changed their minds about the shape of Brexit?
No, but I think it's clearer and harder than it was. Jeremy Corbyn, and what he said this week is much clearer and unequivocal. Labour is for leaving the European Union, and it's part of the deal. One of the big things he raised, state aid, which is part of the thing that Europe doesn't let us do, like, you know, renationalise the railways, such as Southern Rail, but also support our new industries, which we can't do.
Right, but why are they then postponing that point to do all these things into years of transition? They haven't put a date on it. So actually, freedom of movement, which was in the manifesto that was going to end when the UK left the EU, will not happen in 2019.
Well, I think that Labour's preparing for the potential of power. And what's clear, if Labour's in government, could happen at any time with the way Theresa May is going, and Jeremy Corbyn's Prime Minister, he will continue and lead negotiations. He will get us out of the EU quicker than Theresa May, I think.
Oh, yes.
Quicker. And the key things he said, there will have to be a deal on immigration. It's not going to be free movement. And state aid. They're the two big things, I think, out there that are crucial to our economy and to the voters.
Right, well, let's talk about that, because is the Labour leadership honouring the result of the EU referendum by advocating staying in the single market?
That's not quite, or at all, in fact, what Jeremy is saying. Jeremy's saying there isn't.
Right.
Jeremy isn't saying that.
I'm just going to interrupt and we'll come back to that because I think we can see Donald Tusk there, the President of the European Council, exchanging kisses there with Theresa May. Outside the famous black door, lots of smiles for the two of them meeting today. Apparently, she arranged and asked for this meeting when they were at the United Nations, and as we were discussing before, no doubt to try and go perhaps over the heads of Michel Barnier and the negotiating team and see if some pressure can be brought to bear on national governments. That may, of course, be postponed because of the election result in Germany, while Angela Merkel tries to form some sort of coalition. You said that Jeremy Corbyn didn't say he was advocating staying in the single market, but that is the position now in terms of transition.
The Labour position, what Labour will do in power is negotiate the best deal and the best market access.
Well, everyone will say they're going to
absolutely.
arrange the best deal, but I'm trying to clarify with you, are they honouring, hang on, are they honouring the result that John McDonnell said was so important and why they put in the manifesto that there would be an end to freedom of movement, which I presume you supported since you voted leave, that would come in 2019. Now it's not.
There will be an end to freedom of movement if Labour's negotiating this deal, and there won't be a vote. There won't be a vote through Parliament if there isn't an end to freedom of movement that's successful.
I mean,
that's not leaving the European Union.
No, well. So why is Labour saying they're going to stay for another few years? And actually, when asked, they said 2 to 5 years, your colleague Annalise Dodds yesterday. But actually, Jeremy Corbyn said we'll stay as long as necessary.
But Jeremy's the one who's in charge of the party. And I am closer to Jeremy now than at any time since he's been leader in what he is saying. And it's quite crystal clear that there are some things that cannot be negotiated away. We need the freedom to intervene as government in industry, and there will not be free movement of labour. Now, if those are sorted, everything else and how trade negotiations and what they are, they're important stuff. They're not critical principles, they're objectives to try and reach. But it's right and proper that we're arguing the maximum trade relations with Europe, and that should be the objective in the negotiations.
Clive Lewis, your colleague, said that those calling for an end to freedom of movement are driven by racism. Are you driven by racism?
No.
What do you say to Clive Lewis?
Frankly, you know, well, there are some people on the extremes, on both sides in the Brexit argument, who use absurdities. With Boris Johnson on one side, with Michael Gove, that kind of statement on the other. Labour's actually standing in the mainstream.
Is Clive Lewis not in the mainstream?
Clive Lewis is not in the mainstream. Jeremy Corbyn is now in the mainstream in this country when it comes to Brexit and the EU, that we're leaving, but we're leaving with a good deal and understanding what the principles of that good deal should be.
Just very finally, the majority of your party members want to stay in the single market. Are they wrong?
The majority of Labour voters and the overwhelming majority in the north of England agree with what Jeremy's saying. Let's get out of the EU with a good deal and let's do it quickly.
John Mann, thank you very much.
Straight to Downing Street, Donald Tusk.
The constructive and more realistic tone in the Prime Minister's speech in Florence and of our discussion today. This shows that the philosophy of having a cake and eating it, it's finally coming at an end. At least I hope so. That's good news. But of course, no one will ever tell me that Brexit is a good thing. Because, as I have always said, in fact, Brexit is only about damage control, and I didn't change my opinion. As you know, we will discuss our future relations with the UK once there is so-called sufficient progress. The two sides are working and will work hard at it. But if you ask me, and if today member states ask me, I would say there is no sufficient progress yet. but we will work on it. Thank you. Thank you very much. For now, that's all. Sorry. This way? This way? This way. That's all. Thank you.
Well, Donald Tusk, with a wave, exits the shop there. Some interesting words. Said that Brexit was ultimately about damage control. It couldn't be seen as a good thing, but did say that a constructive tone could be found in the words of Theresa May in that Florence speech.
More realism. Interesting.
Take you back to Downing Street. Our political correspondent Tom Rayner was listening to what Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, was telling journalists who had gathered there. He said that no one will ever tell me that Brexit is a good thing.
That's right. It was an interesting statement, wasn't it, Colin? Saying that he was cautiously optimistic as a result of that meeting with the Prime Minister, saying that there was some sense that there was constructive progress being made. But ultimately, his judgment, based on that meeting that he's just had with the Prime Minister, is that there is still not sufficient progress for the negotiations to move on to their next stage, those negotiations between David Davis and Michel Barnier in Brussels. The next stage being the point at which the UK can start to discuss what its relationship with the EU might look like in terms of things like its economic relationship and all the rest of it. And I think that that is going to be seized upon. That's a significant statement. He also said that this meeting has given him the sense that it is the end of the having your cake and eat it period of the British negotiating position. Again, pretty damning thing to say for the EU Council President to stand in Downing Street in front of the door of number 10 to say that. Pretty remarkable. And finally, in line perhaps, or at least addressing some of those demands set out by the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson in that Telegraph article where he was asking for more positivity. I mean, he was writing in terms to a domestic audience in many ways, but the idea that Brexit could have positives. Theresa May also echoed those in that meeting that she had with Donald Tusk when we had the cameras in there, where she said she thinks there could be a solution which is beneficial to both the EU27 and the UK. Donald Tusk sort of put pay to that, where he said that no one will persuade him that Brexit is anything other than a process of damage limitation.
Tom, thanks a lot. The key lines are at the end there. Sufficient progress not yet been made in the Brexit talks to allow negotiations to move on to the next phase. The next phase, of course, involves trade talks scheduled, if all goes well, for October. Let's bring in Ali Renison, who's Head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors. Joins us actually from the Labour conference in Brighton. Ali Renison, welcome to you. Not exactly gushing there, Donald Tusk, was he?
I think he was, as he said, cautiously optimistic. We are one day into the latest negotiating round, so all eyes will be on the press conference between David Davis and Michel Barnier on Thursday to see if enough progress has been made. But we know that sort of the main impasse is around the financial settlement. The Prime Minister did talk about settling obligations, fulfilling obligations in her Florence speech last week. So I think the question is that actually translated into formal negotiating proposals? But there's also some ways to be made on citizens' rights issues as well. It's
interesting you point us in the direction of Michel Barnier and David Davis, because sometimes it can appear that the conversation is following several different routes. We've got Donald Tusk making some comments there. You occasionally have Jean-Claude Juncker coming out and saying things. But as far as you're concerned, the big game in town remains what's passing between Barnier and Davis in Brussels. That's the one to watch.
Yes, I mean, I think there are obviously technical negotiating groups going on throughout this week. They started yesterday, but I think, all eyes will be on that press conference on Thursday. It was interesting, actually, because one of the main issues that I think a lot of our members and businesses and other stakeholders around the country are focused on is getting that transitional arrangement that the PM talked about last week. Now, at the end of the negotiating round the last time, Michel Barnier, maybe a little bit of gamesmanship, sort of said he was still waiting for a UK request. So, I think the question that comes out of this week's round, beyond some of those negotiating issues, is, are we talking transition yet?
You mentioned stakeholders. You could argue one group of stakeholders who feel perhaps increasingly marginalised to the other voters. And if you think that 7 out of 10 Labour constituencies voted for Brexit, you're there at the conference. Does it feel like a party that whose members and delegates you're moving amongst, and activists you're moving amongst, does it feel like a party which saw 7 out of its 10 constituencies that it won voting for Brexit?
I think there's certainly a lot of robust debate about the way forward, whether and how free movement should end, what kind of trading arrangements you'll get. But it's certainly, you will have heard the news about the fact that Brexit is not amongst the top 8 topics that the conference delegates are actually voting on. So it feels like a very intense discussion, but somewhat at the margins.
Yeah. Are people talking about transitional arrangements? Because I'm imagining that from the Institute of Directors' point of view, talk of transitional arrangements, 2 years, who knows, perhaps longer, was manna from heaven. I mean, it was exactly what you wanted to hear, giving businesses longer to readjust.
It felt a little bit overdue, but I think there was a lot of collective sigh of relief that this was a sort of cabinet-backed priority that was put forward by the Prime Minister in her speech. Yes, she talked a little bit about implementation. The main issue is that we now know that the government wants it, will be pursuing it. The question is how long, keeping in mind that 2 years, it depends on whether that extra 2 years is just for negotiating a new free trade arrangement or whether that includes the year that business probably needs to adjust once the agreement's actually in place. But now, all eyes are on how that request is put forward and at what point the UK and the EU will discuss it.
Yeah. Ali, I think I'm right in saying, if my memory serves, that the Institute of Directors didn't formally come down one way or t'other in the Brexit debate, but they did make lots of warnings about what would happen to the economy as a consequence, some pretty dire warnings. The Treasury was saying that something like 500,000 jobs might have been lost as a consequence of Brexit. The reality is that unemployment in the UK is down to 1975 levels. Do you accept at the Institute of Directors that, at least so far, the dire consequences that would follow from a Brexit vote haven't materialised, potentially quite the opposite?
I don't know if we made really, really dire predictions ahead of the referendum. As you say, we were sort of robustly neutral, so to speak. I do think it's interesting that, we have to separate some of the forecasts around what would happen after the referendum vote itself and what might still be to come. Now, obviously, I think some of the predictions around the economic impacts following the referendum vote haven't come to pass to the extent that certain forecasters were predicting. But I think that in terms of making sure that we don't have any dire warnings, whoever they were made by, fulfilled, we need to make sure that we have a transitional period that allows the time and the space not only for government to negotiate its most ambitious free trade agreement and for the EU's as well ever, but also for businesses to prepare and adjust to it. And I think that will be crucial to making sure that no sort of disaster is impending.
Yeah. In the conversations you're having with people at that conference, I'm guessing the single market is the key thing from the Institute of Directors' point of view that you want to discuss. There is that, in the minds of some people, the impossibility of squaring the circle, that if you want to retain the single market, then free movement of labour has to go. I've had this conversation with people from the Institute of Directors before. Big business, you represent big business, love the idea of a flexible labour market. You love the idea of being able to import people from other parts of Europe to work in our labour market. It keeps your costs down.
I mean, probably worth saying that about 80% members of the IOD run SMEs, so I'm not quite sure the big business mantle totally fits there. I think that business has accepted that free movement as we currently know it is going to come to an end, and I think the most important priority now is A, making sure that 40% of our members employ EU nationals, many of them highly skilled, making sure that their rights and ability to stay in the UK are protected, and then looking to see what is the next step in terms of a preferential, reciprocal arrangement for people to continue being able to live and work in the UK and to go to the EU, even if it's not actually free movement.
Ali Redison from the Institute of Directors. Ali, thanks for your time. Thanks a lot.
The President of the EU Council says there hasn't been sufficient progress at the Brexit talks for negotiators to move on to discussing Britain's future relations with the EU. Donald Tusk, who met Theresa May in Downing Street today, was speaking as a fourth round of negotiations were underway in Brussels.
If you ask me, and if today member states asked me, I would say there is no sufficient progress yet, but we will work on it.
Donald Tusk there. Well, our political correspondent Chris Mason is in Downing Street. Chris, this doesn't bode well for those talks. I mean, David Davis was hoping for a breakthrough.
Yeah, on the face of it, George, it doesn't. The whole point of that speech from the Prime Minister in Florence last week on Brexit was to try and act as a lubricant to the talks that are grinding on in Brussels with real frustration on both sides about a lack of progress. Now, Mr Tusk, who is one of the big hitters in Brussels, did say he welcomed what he saw as the constructive tone of the Prime Minister, but crucially, and you saw it there, he said there hadn't been sufficient progress in the talks, and that really matters because until the EU determines there's been sufficient progress on the current negotiations on unknotting our current relationship with the EU, they say there can't be movement on to the future trading relationship. So, did Mrs May's words in Italy last week do the business? Well, a bit, yes, but perhaps not enough yet from her perspective. They won't be worried about that yet here or surprised at what Mr Tusk said, but we'll really hope they can point to progress on Thursday at the end of the current round of negotiations.
Chris, thank you very much.
Now, the head of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has warned that Brexit talks haven't made sufficient progress for talks on a future trading relationship with the UK to begin. Meanwhile, in a speech on European integration, France's President, Emmanuel Macron, said he could imagine a Europe which Britain could rejoin. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, has this.
With the clock ticking down to an EU summit in 3 weeks, Donald Tusk came in search of details on the divorce concessions Theresa May could make to unblock the Brexit talks. But beyond polite appearances, there was no such breakthrough, just more grin and bear it. Small talk in front of cameras is often awkward, especially so 6 frustrating months on from the triggering of Article 50. And while Mr Tusk praised the PM for her speech last week in Florence, he made it clear she needed to go further.
Yeah. To do something maybe more substantial, but...
Afterwards, he said the UK was dropping what he called its have its cake and eat it approach, though that was still not enough for trade talks to begin.
I would say there is no sufficient progress yet, but we will work on it.
So no change from yesterday, when Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, tried to nail down concessions from the British side. But from the Foreign Secretary visiting Central Europe, an outburst of frustration today at the EU's refusal to talk about trade now.
We think it's time to talk about the future. It's time to float this ship down the slipway and get it onto the open seas and get moving.
Yet Europe's most powerful leader is in danger of losing whatever focus she had on Brexit. A newly re-elected Angela Merkel was meeting her parliamentary party ahead of talks on forming a new coalition, which could drag on for weeks. And Europe could become preoccupied with Catalonia's referendum if it goes ahead this weekend, if the region really does declare independence from Spain. In Paris today, they were protesting, as they often do, against the president France recently voted for. While inside the lofty Sorbonne University, Emmanuel Macron set out an equally lofty vision for a united Europe, a Eurozone budget, a budget for joint defence, and remarkably, space for the UK to join in.
Britain could regain its place in the EU. Discussions are underway which don't define the future of Europe. But in this revamped, simplified European Union that I'm proposing, I don't rule out that Britain could find its place.
For now, that's all, sorry.
But fat chance of the UK rejoining Europe when, like Donald Tusk in Downing Street today, it is still working out how to leave, while the rest of the EU waits to hear just how much of an exit bill Britain will pay.
Jonathan Rugman reporting.
Well, the response from various quarters in the EU to Mrs May's Florence speech on Brexit have certainly been consistent. They welcomed the change in tone, but still reckon not enough has been achieved so far. Today it was the turn of the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, to say there was still insufficient progress. But he did concede on a trip to London today that Britain appeared to have given up on its idea of having its cake and eating it. And the author of that particular metaphor, Boris Johnson, came up with another this evening. It is time, he said, to float this ship down the slipway.
The wheels of the Brexit talks certainly need a little oiling, and Theresa May is hoping Donald Tusk will be the man to do it. The handshakes were warm, but the European Council president didn't look too optimistic as he went into Downing Street.
Mr. Tusk, how are the talks going?
That deep and special partnership.
With all the talk of deep and special, the Prime Minister wants the UK's warmer approach to move the negotiations on. So far, the view from Europe has been good try, but not there yet. So the diplomatic ante is being upped. Donald Tusk wooed in Downing Street, while David Davis gets on with the fourth round of official talks in Brussels. As he left Number 10, Mr. Tusk did welcome the fact that the UK was no longer trying to have its cake and eat it. But as for moving the talks on to discussing trade...
If you ask me, and if today member states asked me, I would say there is no sufficient progress yet. But we will work.
That provoked a frustrated response from the Foreign Secretary.
We think it's time to talk about the future. It's time to float this ship down the slipway and get it onto the open seas and get moving.
Whilst the UK tries to find its way out, in Paris the French president called for greater integration of those still in.
Le Royaume-Uni pourra trouver la place qui est la sienne.
Whilst even suggesting there could still be a place for the UK in a revamped EU.
So, cakes are off the table as far as Donald Tusk is concerned, but still very much on it are the thorny issues of the Irish border question, citizens' rights and the divorce bill. Downing Street was hoping that Mrs May's Florence speech would be a game changer. It hasn't been that yet. Romilly Weeks, News at 10, Downing Street.
I've been getting